or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Evelyn, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the March 8th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The apartments at the center of Mamdani's affordable housing crisis. The mayor's call to freeze the rent galvanized the 69% of New Yorkers who don't own their own homes. But the city's landlords claim the math doesn't add up. By Jonathan Mailer. Jonathan Mailer is the author of 2 books about New York City. He reported this article over 6 weeks, speaking to more than 20 housing experts inside and outside the Mamdani administration. On a chilly afternoon in January, the newly elected mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, stood at a portable lectern in the lobby of a large apartment building in Jackson Heights, Queens. He had come to announce that the city had settled a lawsuit against A&E Real Estate, the owner of the building, for violations at 14 of its properties. But really he had come to send a message both to the city's landlords and to the constituency that had just swept him into office, New York City's tenants. For years, A&E has operated with callous disregard for those residing in its properties, the mayor said. This is not just a failure to serve those to whom it holds an obligation. It is an overt cruelty to tens of thousands of New Yorkers. It was an unusual scene. The mayor of New York, using the occasion of a relatively small settlement, $2.1 million, to call out one of the city's largest landlords inside one of the landlord's own buildings. When it comes to the matter of housing, Mamdani is practicing a very different kind of politics. There's an adage in mainstream Democratic circles that property owners vote at higher rates than renters, and therefore you should campaign and govern for owners. Mamdani has made a different calculation. New York has long been a city of renters. 69% of its residents don't own their homes, and he aimed his candidacy at them, promising to freeze the rent, a phrase that quickly became the campaign's trademark slogan, the progressive version of Build the Wall. Citywide, he dominated precincts with the largest share of renters, not only the poor, but also younger, higher-income renters, including residents of the so-called Commie Corridor, the neighborhoods across Queens and northern Brooklyn that formed his base. The leaseholder of a rent-stabilized one-bedroom apartment in Astoria, Queens, Mamdani was the first tenant to be elected mayor of New York City since Ed Koch in 1977. Even the progressive Bill de Blasio owned a $1 million brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and for that matter, a small rental property. More to the point, Mamdani was the first politician in the city's modern era to tap into the political power of the city's tenant class. Now that he was in office, it was time to transition from campaigning for renters to governing for them, and a large rent-stabilized apartment building in the densely populated working-class neighborhood of Jackson Heights was a natural place to start. Standing behind him that afternoon was Sia Weaver, the 37-year-old head of the mayor's office to protect tenants, a self-identified socialist and veteran tenants' rights activist. Weaver was one of a few advisors who had suggested to Mamdani that he make a public example of A&E. She was familiar with the company from her years in the trenches of the city's housing wars and had even organized at some of its buildings. A&E's executive chairman, Douglas Eisenberg, had always been an intriguing figure to her. He was part of the city's powerful real estate community, the developers who saw themselves as the builders and shapers of New York, but he wasn't a builder. He's a member of that group, but he's an outlier, Weaver told me. He's a straight-up slumlord. Entire books have been written about the complex swirl of economic forces and political decisions that produced New York's affordable housing crisis. But at the end of the day, the crisis can be reduced to the gulf that separates the ownership class from the tenant class, and that gulf can be reduced to a single word: rent. The rent is the crisis. Only 1.4% of the city's apartments are now available for rent, and a mere 0.4% of those apartments cost less than $1,100 per month. More than half of New York's renters spend in excess of 30% of their income on rent, qualifying them as rent-burdened, according to the definition used by most economists. A third spend more than 50%. Mamdani has a plan to build a lot more affordable housing, but that will take years. He wants to deliver for struggling tenants now, and it's Weaver's job to figure out how. Most cities have only a smattering of rent-regulated housing units. In New York, more than 40% of the rental apartments, a million or so units, are stabilized, which puts the city in a unique position. It has what is effectively a dial to exert at least some measure of control over the housing market. These apartments are the legacy of a city with a long history of crowded slums, tenant activism, and progressive politics, but they are now at the center of what may be the defining debate of Mamdani era. To some, they are a precious natural resource, a bulwark against the city's ever-growing imbalance between housing costs and wage growth, the only thing allowing many thousands of middle-class New Yorkers to live in the city and preventing many thousands more from winding up in shelters or on the streets. To others, these apartments, with their artificially suppressed market-distorting rents, are a big reason the city is facing an affordable housing crisis in the first place. It's a debate that mirrors a larger one on the left as a new generation of progressive challenges the free market orthodoxy of older, more moderate Democrats. New York may be a city of renters, but it is also the beating heart of real estate capital. There is no clearer demonstration of power in New York than developing a large piece of property. Mamdani has visions of developing a lot of it, starting with 12,000 homes over a rail yard in Sunnyside, Queens, a plan that he has asked a former New York City real estate developer and Queens native, President Trump, to help make a reality. The real estate industry plays an outsized role in the city's economy. In New York's post-industrial incarnation, real estate appreciation powers its financial growth. Real estate taxes are by far the city government's single largest source of income, accounting for as much as 50% of its tax revenue, which has given the industry an elevated stature in New York. The battle between reformers like Weaver and owners like Eisenberg has long defined the politics of the city, determining how its scarcest and most valuable resource, its land, is used. But under Mamdani, the balance of power is shifting, perhaps significantly. We got used to the landlords and developers, the ones who build the city and provide its tax base, being the protagonists, and to the tenants being a special interest group, says Samuel Stein, a housing policy analyst at the Community Service Society in New York. Now the tenants are the protagonists. They are a large majority of the city and the ones experiencing the conditions in its buildings. And the landlords and developers are the special interests. The first thing to know about Douglas Eisenberg is that whatever the new mayor's staff might say, he doesn't think he's a slumlord. We got into this to make a reasonable return, but also to do the right thing, Eisenberg says of his entry into the city's rent-stabilized market roughly 15 years ago. We wanted to find buildings that had not been taken care of, capital-starved. The bigger the mess, the better, so we could roll up our sleeves and do the work and turn the building around. I didn't expect Eisenberg to agree to speak with me when I reached out to him in late January, and his publicist initially advised him not to. but he was eager to tell his side of the story and invited me to meet him at his company's office, which occupies the 17th floor of a modern skyscraper in Midtown, around the corner from Trump Tower. I have been writing about the city for many years and have met a lot of swaggering real estate moguls along the way. Eisenberg has a very different demeanor, soft-spoken, even earnest. He had clearly spent a lot of time preparing for my visit and brought out a folder of documents to illustrate the existential problem his business is now facing. Eisenberg presides over one of the biggest portfolios of rent-stabilized properties in the city. His company owns a total of about 16,000 apartments in around 180 buildings across every borough except Staten Island, including the Riverton Houses, a historic middle-class housing complex in Harlem, where the former mayor David Dinkins lived for many years. This year has not gotten off to a great start for Eisenberg. Like many developers and landlords, he donated generously to Andrew Cuomo's mayoral campaign, giving $125,000 to one of his political action committees, hoping for a miracle. After the election, Eisenberg moved quickly to settle the city's lawsuit against his company, signing the agreement on the last day of the Adams administration. He assumed that he had at least put that matter behind him. Instead, he was soon accused of overt cruelty by the new mayor in the lobby of one of his own buildings. 5 days after the mayor's news conference in Jackson Heights, the city's public advocate, Juman Williams, announced the release of his annual worst landlord list outside another one of A&E's buildings in Brooklyn. 2 of the company's executives, its president and chief operating officer, took the top 2 spots. According to Williams, those 2 executives were cited for a record 8,761 violations in 2025. On top of all this, A&E is facing at least a dozen lawsuits from tenants who have accused it of overcharging renters, failing to deal with a host of problems in its buildings: rampant infestations, black mold, broken elevators, chronic leaks, and more, and harassing tenants in an effort to push them out of their apartments. And Eisenberg says he is still in the process of trying to renegotiate the terms of a $506 million loan for a group of properties that he had defaulted on last year. Eisenberg, who is 55, grew up in Manhattan, attending the Trinity School and then Cornell University. He spent 2 college summers in the early 1990s working for Mayor Dinkins, but when he graduated from college in 1995, he joined his father's real estate company. 16 years later, he struck out on his own, forming A&E on the kitchen table of his Upper East Side apartment. He and his co-founder had a simple business plan, one that they believed would be both profitable and socially redeeming. They would buy neglected rental buildings, fix them up, and raise the rents. At the time, New York State's rent stabilization laws were designed to incentivize owners to invest in their properties. For example, if Eisenberg spent $40,000 on a given unit, he would be entitled to raise the rent $1,000. Upgrades to buildings, like replacing a boiler or a roof, could also be passed along to tenants in the form of individual rent increases. There were vacancy bonuses too. Whenever a rent-stabilized apartment became empty, he could increase the rent by about 20%, up to 20%. In addition, there were the incremental annual increases typically approved by the city's Rent Guidelines Board, which regulates the pricing for stabilized housing. Once the price of an apartment crossed a certain threshold, the number varied from year to year based on a variety of factors. It was removed from the rent stabilization system, and he could charge whatever he thought the market would bear. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 8th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. But in 2019, the state's rent stabilization laws abruptly changed, and A&E's business model soon collapsed. That year, a newly elected slate of progressive legislators led the passage of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. Under the new law, Eisenberg could no longer raise rents when apartments were vacated, and strict caps were placed on his ability to pass along a percentage of his expenditures to tenants. Rather than adding 1/60th of what he spent on apartment improvements to the rent, add 1/80th. And instead of adding 6% of what he spent on building upgrades to individual rents, he could add only 2%. It also became much more difficult for him to take action against tenants who failed to pay their rent. The new law significantly slowed the eviction process and empowered housing courts to postpone evictions for up to a year. Even as Eisenberg's ability to generate income from these buildings was being squeezed, his expenses were soaring. Since 2019, he says, the taxes on his rent-stabilized portfolio have gone up 109%. The water and sewer costs in these buildings have risen 50%, and his insurance premiums have gone up a staggering 239%, a stark reflection of insurers' declining faith in the health of the city's rent-stabilized housing stock. During the same period, the average rent in his rent-stabilized portfolio rose only 15%. Foreclosures of rent-stabilized buildings are already spiking across the city. Greg Corbin, a distressed real estate expert at Northgate Real Estates Group, estimates that they were up 30 to 35% last year. He expects foreclosures on rent-stabilized buildings to reach record levels in 2026. And even these numbers may understate the challenge that landlords are facing. Many lenders are doing everything they can to avoid foreclosing on these properties because they have no desire to take possession of them. Their value as financial assets is in steep decline, and because they are generally old buildings with spotty records of capital investment, they are expensive to maintain. Even in the face of the housing crisis, there are an estimated 50,000 empty apartments in the city, ghost apartments, that owners say aren't worth investing capital in because the rents are too low to recover their expenses. Facing mounting losses and the prospect of defaults and foreclosures, landlords say that they've had no choice but to cut back on maintenance in ways both large and small. Eisenberg, for instance, stopped buying expensive rodent-repellent trash bags at his properties, with predictable consequences. He acknowledges that violations are rising at his buildings, but he also told me that he has been trying to address them, an inherently slow process because he has to wait for the city to send building inspectors to his properties who often need permission from tenants to access their apartments. And Eisenberg says that he has never tried to push a tenant out of a building in order to drive up the rent. He only undertakes eviction proceedings as a last resort, he says, when tenants fall months behind on their rent. Eisenberg walked me through the finances of a representative building in Queens to demonstrate the untenability of his situation. A&E purchased the building, which has around 175 apartment units, in 2013 for $25 million. The company borrowed $17.5 million, or 70% of the total purchase price, to complete the deal. The building was in bad shape and required about $3 million in repairs, including a new roof, a new boiler, and major facade work. In 2014, A&E's first full year of ownership, the building's net income was about $1.2 million. In 2018, before the new stabilization laws went into effect, it was $1.7 million. By last year, net income had fallen to less than half that, $681,000, not nearly enough to cover the building's annual $1.2 million in debt service payments. Maybe most striking of all is the fact that the property is $1.7 million in arrears. Nearly half of its tenants are behind on their rent, some by many months. The building is now worth about 30% of what A&E paid for it 13 years ago. After 2019, we spent a lot of time trying to tinker with our model to try to figure out a way to make it work, Eisenberg said. I think what you've seen is that it's impossible to make it work. The math is just the math. The math may soon get even worse. Starting this month, the city's Rent Guidelines Board will hold its annual public hearings to debate how much landlords of stabilized buildings will be allowed to raise rents. The mayor's opportunity to turn his campaign promise into policy. Less than 2 years ago, as a member of the New York State Assembly, Mamdani was arrested while protesting the board's decision to approve an increase of 2.75% for one-year leases and 5.25% for two-year leases. Now a majority of the 9-member board are his appointees, making even a small increase unlikely. We are in such deep trouble right now, and people don't understand it, says Kenny Burgos, a schoolmate of Mamdani's at the Bronx High School of Science, who runs the New York Apartment Association, a lobbying group representing owners and landlords. What is the value of a rent-stabilized building right now? It sounds callous to say it, but the next owner has just bought New York City dirt that happens to have a building on top of it. The affordable housing crisis is a national phenomenon. Nearly half of all renters across the country are now considered rent-burdened, but it is also a generational phenomenon. About half of the young participants in a recent New York Times Siena poll said their primary concern was affordable housing, and that they worried about it more than every other expense item combined, including retirement, health care, education, bills, transportation, and food. In 2014, the median age of a first-time home buyer in the United States was 31. Last year, it reached a record high of 40. Property ownership has long been viewed as a pillar of American wealth generation, but to an increasing number of young Americans, the notion of ever owning a home has become pretty much inconceivable. This is especially true of young Americans who live in New York City, where the median apartment sells for close to $800,000. One way to look at Mamdani's rise, and in turn Sia Weaver's, is as the coming of age of a generation that identifies not with owners but with tenants. My generation does not see home ownership as an attainable thing, Weaver told me when we met for the first time in January at City Hall. Weaver grew up in Rochester, New York, and attended Bryn Mawr College, where she wrote her thesis about mass public housing experiments in the United States and Germany. After graduating in 2010, she moved to Crown Heights, Brooklyn, to become a tenants organizer. It was the aftermath of the mortgage crisis, and private equity firms and other investors were swooping into the market to buy up buildings that had fallen into foreclosure, often intending to push out tenants and drive up rents. While Eisenberg was building his portfolio of rent-stabilized buildings, Weaver was organizing tenants in rent-stabilized buildings that were in financial distress. It was often frustrating work, she said. She said, consumed by battles over individual buildings. But what she really wanted was to address what she saw as the larger structural problem, real estate speculation. In 2019, Weaver led the effort to overhaul New York's rent stabilization laws, helping draft the bill and spending months driving across the state to rally support for it. It was around this time that she first met Mamdani at a reading group for the socialist magazine Jacobin. He was a few years younger, with different political ambitions, but he was also steeped in the tenants' rights movement. Mamdani soon started working with immigrants across Queens who were at risk of losing their homes, and Weaver became an important influence on him. In an interview in 2021, he said that he gets all of his ideas about housing from her. When Mamdani told Weaver in the summer of 2024 that he was planning to run for mayor, he made it clear that he wanted tenants to be a key part of his constituency. We can win if we get renters, new immigrants, and young people, he said. That's basically what happened. An election that was expected to turn on public safety instead turned on affordability, housing in particular, and the city's diffuse tenants' rights movement coalesced behind him. It's hard to overstate how differently Weaver views housing policy from what has long been the conventional wisdom on both the left and the right. To begin with, she is deeply skeptical of the very concept of home ownership, going so far as to describe it in a 2019 social media post as a weapon of white supremacy masquerading as wealth-building public policy. The post resurfaced after Weaver's appointment by Mamdani, landing her on the cover of the New York Post and drawing mockery from Vice President J.D. Vance. She told me that she would use different language if she were writing it today, but she also defended the basic thrust of her argument. Housing policies have historically prioritized owners over renters under the guise of democratizing wealth building, but in practice, these policies have only widened inequality. Against this backdrop, you can see New York's rent-stabilized apartments as more than just temporary living spaces. They are as close as many of their residents will ever get to owning a home, providing both security in the form of predictable rents and an inheritance that can be passed down to their children in the form of a lease. When people say that they want home ownership, they're not always saying that they want to become millionaires or join the propertied class, Weaver told me. They are saying that they want stability and control and dignity. To Weaver, the crisis isn't that property owners aren't collecting enough rent to cover their loans. It's that millions of New Yorkers can barely afford to keep a roof over their heads. Non-payment went up because people are poor, she said when I asked her about the growing number of tenants who have fallen months behind on rent. The inequality in this city is crazy. That math may not work for Eisenberg, but Weaver wants to change the whole equation. As she sees it, he and many owners like him overpaid for rent-stabilized buildings and took on too much debt under the assumption that they would be able to meaningfully raise rents and turn over apartments year after year. To the extent that these owners now find themselves underwater, unable to cover their loans and sliding toward foreclosure, she sees an opportunity to reset the values of these buildings and their debt levels. That could happen through negotiations between lenders and owners, or when necessary, through foreclosure sales and bankruptcy auctions. The process is likely to be messy and financially damaging, and perhaps even ruinous to current owners, but Weaver argues that tenants will ultimately benefit. Once the finances of these buildings have been restructured, a greater percentage of their rent rolls can go toward maintaining the properties and a smaller percentage can go toward banks and investors. There was a business model that was based on speculation, she says. Now there needs to be a new business model that is based on the reality that these buildings are rent-stabilized and are going to stay rent-stabilized. For decades, New York and many other cities have hewed to the belief that the best way to create affordable housing was to incentivize private investment in it, and that the best way to drive down rents was to loosen rent control restrictions. Weaver believes that this whole approach was wrong and that encouraging real estate speculation has only exacerbated the city's housing crisis by spurring landlords to seek out ways to evict tenants and push up rents. What Eisenberg sees as a virtuous circle, upgrading buildings, raising rents, increasing property values, Weaver sees as a vicious cycle that New York finally has the opportunity to break. On a bitter cold Friday night in late January, a few days after my interview with Eisenberg, I met Weaver for a beer at a bar near her apartment in Crown Heights. Once we settled into a table in the back, I asked her if, after all of her years as a grassroots organizer, she had any reservations about joining the city's bureaucracy. I'm a socialist, she said. If you're going to believe in socialism, you have to make a lot more people believe in government. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 8th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Weaver has long wanted to see the government take a much more aggressive role in shaping housing policy in New York, and she is suddenly in a position to make it happen. As an organizer, she struggled to turn out tenants for meetings. Now she can leverage the resources of the city to reach thousands of tenants at a time and turn out the mayor for events and meetings. In the months ahead, as more property owners default on their loans, she envisions the city intervening in foreclosures and bankruptcy auctions to help determine the future of these buildings, trying to steer them toward less profit-driven stewards, like nonprofit groups or even the city itself. It's a radical notion in a hyper-capitalistic city whose modern economy was built on the concept of private land ownership, a wholesale rethinking of how the city's economy works and for whom. Weaver tried to do this on a much smaller scale as a tenant organizer without much success, but she now has the full force of City Hall behind her. We haven't had a governing moment like this in a long time, Weaver told me. By now it had gotten loud in the back of the bar, and we had moved to the front. We don't really owe anyone anything, she continued. It's exciting, but it's also pretty scary. Ideas. In a world order defined by Trump, the key to Europe's defense is Germany. In the wake of the U.S. bombing of Iran and its dismissal of European allies, an anxious continent's best chance at security runs through its largest economy. By Elizabeth Zurawski. The standing ovation that followed Secretary of State Marco Rubio's speech at the Munich Security Conference in February may have been more diplomatic gesture than sincere expression of appreciation, despite public assertions from European leaders that they were reassured by Rubio's conciliatory tone. Private discussions were far more sober. After all, it had been only 3 weeks since President Trump backed down on his threat to take Greenland. For the Europeans, the prospect of a military strike against them by their most important ally had already marked a point of no return. Trump's failure to meaningfully consult with the Europeans before launching airstrikes with Israel against Iran on Saturday, putting Europe, which is within range of Iranian missiles, at risk of retaliatory strikes, seemed to some the consummation of the administration's disdain. At a panel discussion in Munich, Konstanz Stelzenmüller, a prominent German security expert at the Brookings Institution, had summed up the mood deftly. At bottom, she observed, the Trump administration is saying that it is always ready to coerce, that it can make others do what it wants by threatening them. Europeans are concluding, she said, that they need to put themselves in a position where that's not possible. President Emmanuel Macron of France evinced a similar resolve on Monday, declaring in the wake of the attacks on Iran and the country's attacks on its neighbors that in order to be free, we must be feared, before announcing that France would boost its nuclear arsenal and extend its protection over other parts of Europe. From the start, the second Trump administration has exhibited a new level of animosity toward Europe, seeming to treat it as a more adversary than ally. The administration's latest national security strategy memo, released in November, fulminated about a future in which the perils posed by Europe's fundamental military weakness and economic stagnation would be eclipsed by the civilizational erasure of mass migration. European officials reacted with shock and outrage, mainly around the contempt that was directed against Europe, as Emily Haber, a former German ambassador to the United States, put it, but also because while Europe has made real progress in lessening its dependence on the U.S., it remains unable to fully guarantee its own security for reasons that go beyond inert bureaucrats in Brussels. As an economic power, the European Union is the third largest in the world. Yet, as a collection of 27 separate countries, even with with an even greater number of national armies participating in NATO, it relies on troops that lack the uniformity and unified force of an equal number of American troops. Decentralization also complicates Europe's ability to produce the weapons it needs. European NATO countries must work together, yet they are often at loggerheads over which country's economic needs will be prioritized. Increased spending on defense is already fraught. France and Italy have extremely high levels of debt, making it difficult for them to finance a military buildup. And though Germany is the largest economy in the bloc and may soon have the strongest conventional army, many Germans are averse to fighting and especially to providing soldiers for a potential peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Public opinion polls show that Germany is the only country where a majority of the population is opposed to doing so, even if it means peace in Ukraine fails. A few weeks after Trump vowed to take Greenland the easy way or the hard way, Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany acknowledged that Europeans committed to international law might soon find themselves overtaken by the new reigning logic of hard power. We will only be able to implement our ideas in the world, at least in part, if we ourselves learn to speak the language of power politics, if we ourselves become a European power. Merz said. Becoming a European power, he argued, means that Germany, which is not only the wealthiest country in the European Union, but also the most populous, must commit to what Merz called a shift in mentality, to longer work hours and increasing productivity, so that German prosperity can help sustain the continent through whatever unforeseen threats will surely arise in Ukraine, Greenland, or elsewhere. Merz, in a visit planned long before the Iran campaign, is meeting with Trump in Washington. While Iran will surely dominate the discussion, Merz will very likely also press his case for Ukraine and against tariffs. He has long insisted, as he did in Davos in January, that economic competitiveness and the ability to shape global politics are two sides of the same coin. But the same forces that are scrambling geopolitical alliances for Europe are also upsetting economic ones, as Germany grapples with the tariffs imposed by the United States and declining demand from China. If Merz blunders, the far-right ascendant in Germany, as in the rest of Europe, stands ready to capitalize and to assert its very different ideas about the uses of restored German might. It is no small paradox that Munich, the city in which many of the last century's calamities began, has become the hub for world leaders and defense officials still committed to the rule of law. The annual Munich Security Conference began in 1963 primarily as a gathering between the United States, which spent half a century occupying, reforming, and rebuilding Germany into a free market liberal democracy, and its West German counterparts on the front lines of the Cold War. Germany's post-war constitution places strict limits on what kind of army Germany can maintain and under what circumstances it can be deployed abroad. German intelligence gathering is similarly constrained. Of the terrorist threats to the country that come to light, only 2% are discovered via German intelligence, according to a report in the newspaper Bild, which cited a confidential agency document. A majority come through tips from the United States. These restrictions were widely embraced until Germany solidified its place among European democracies and the prospect of Russian aggression weighed more heavily. The Polish foreign minister Radosław Sikorski famously said more than a decade ago that he feared Germany's power less than I fear its inaction, and it seems that much of the rest of the continent now agrees. While Germany's economic strength placed it in a leadership position, During the European debt crisis that followed the 2008 financial crash, it has taken 2 waves of war with Russia over the last 10 years to get a reluctant German population even nominally on board with building up the country's military capabilities. According to a Politico survey conducted in February, 54% of Germans support increased defense spending, a majority but a smaller one than in the United Kingdom and Poland. Trepidation toward the army remains part of Germany's hard-won post-war memory culture. To quote one meme that circulated not long ago on X, "As a German, I just want to get this straight. The entire Western world wants us to build up a huge army, march through Poland, and fight the Russians if necessary. Just writing it down so there are no misunderstandings in the future." As a central player in the defense strategy of a newly emboldened Europe, Germany has been most decisive in deploying its financial power. By 2025, Germany was contributing as much to NATO's common funds as the United States and spending more on procurements alone than all other European NATO countries combined did in 2021. But like other European countries, Germany is still scrambling to increase equipment stocks, which means deciding whether to buy from the U.S. or invest in expanding European production, a trade-off between speed and independence. When intra-European deals are struck, individual countries' national interests can get in the way of collective ones. A joint Franco-Spanish-Germany next-generation fighter jet program called Future Combat Air System, or FCAS, which began in 2017, stalled last year over disagreements on the original contract, which split industrial production evenly among the 3 nations. One of the French industrial partners, Dassault Aviation, argued that because of concerns around efficiency and intellectual property, among other things, it should take over more of the leadership and the bulk of production. When news broke in the German press last fall that Germany and Spain were considering moving ahead without France, Dassault's chief executive, Eric Trappier, hit back publicly, saying that the French were the ones with the necessary know-how. A policy advisor from Merz's party, who asked not to be named because he was not authorized to speak publicly, described Germany's deep frustration with the stalemate. "FCAS will fail. It's dead," he told me. "We have to cancel our most important defense project with our most valued partner because some HR guy in Dassault says no." After the Munich conference, Europe's 6 largest economies announced plans for a capital market union, which would allow them to pool resources for collective financing and cooperative production. This is in addition to the SAFE program, inaugurated last year, which allows members to borrow money from the European Union to put toward common defense. But it can take years to retrofit factories and scale production, and Germany's procurements plan is based in part on outdated ideas of what modern warfare requires. When 20-odd Russian drones flew into Poland last September, NATO countered with fighter jets and missile defense systems. Shooting down drones that cost 20,000 euros apiece with equipment worth millions of euros is inefficient and unsustainable, not to mention that it signals vulnerability to the Russians. Speaking of Germany's approach, Guntram Wolf, a senior fellow at Bruegel, a European think tank, told me, "Here we are in year 5 of war in Ukraine, and we are ordering tanks, big ships, traditional artillery, infantry, fighting vehicles. Not that we shouldn't, but we don't seem to order the small unmanned speedboats that Ukrainians used that defeated Russian ships in the Black Sea." Europe also remains especially dependent on the U.S. for the technology to power military equipment. Without American software, German-built frigates are just a piece of steel floating in the sea, Wolf says. These high-tech industries and the innovation that comes with them are crucial to stimulating economic growth. But Europe is a continent of savers, not investors, and Germany's are especially cautious with money. The hyperinflation of the 1920s remains a vivid cultural memory, its aftermath proof that catastrophe may be just around the corner. There is even a moral dimension in Germany to eschewing credit. The German words for debt and guilt share the same roof. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 8th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. The preference has real-world costs, not just militarily, but economically. According to Philip Hildebrand, former head of the Swiss National Bank, who is now vice chairman at BlackRock, there are 10 trillion euros sitting in European bank deposits. If 1 to 2% of that money were invested in startups, it would double the funds available annually to European venture capital, where the greatest innovation in defense is happening. It would also help Germany's economy. The research is very clear, Wolf says. U.S. defense spending, because of its high R&D intensity, has a major long-term positive growth effect on the U.S. economy. If Europe continues to rely on the United States, all these R&D and growth benefits won't go to Europe. Germany's economic challenges go beyond defense, reflecting profound systemic shifts that eventually could compromise its and Europe's security. As Thorsten Benner, director of the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, says, Trump sees Germany exports as a threat to the U.S. national interest and wants to cut it down to size, and China has become a mortal threat to German core industries. To ensure Germany's future, MERS must do nothing less than reimagine its economic model, Benner says. These economic vulnerabilities have already become political ones for MERS's government, a coalition of two centrist parties. For most German voters, matters of defense take a back seat to economic ones, and this is especially true of supporters of the Alternative for Germany, the far-right party widely known by its German initials, AfD, that is now topping some polls. The AfD has a long history of being friendly to Russia and wary of remilitarization, and though it has always been kept out of a governing coalition in Germany, it was embraced by Vice President J.D. Vance and President Trump during last year's Munich Security Conference. Trump's recent imperialistic machinations have proved unpopular with European voters, and far-right parties in France, Italy, and the Netherlands, among others, have quickly moved to distance themselves from him. When Trump threatened to invade Greenland, Jordan Bardella, president of France's hard-right National Rally, criticized his direct challenge to the sovereignty of a European country and decried a world in which the law of the strongest trumps respect of international rules. The AfD is more divided because the AfD is strongest in former East Germany, where large parts of the population remain fervently anti-American, tempered by grudging admiration for Trump. Skeptical of the European project and in favor of reconciliation with Russia, the party's more extreme members have little reason to moderate their positions. Anti-Russian sentiment in Eastern Germany is a crucial part of an alternative unification narrative, a way to say that it was not all bad on its side, that East Germans have their own pride and their own history. This cultural divide still hamstrings Germany. It is hard to pull a country together to fight when many East Germans don't hate the enemy and believe that urban liberals, with their embrace of gay rights and other non-traditional values, look down on them. Gorlitz, a small town on the border with Poland, whose candy-colored Central European architecture has been resplendently restored, Wes Anderson filmed parts of the Grand Budapest Hotel there, is now a stronghold of the AfD. It is also the site of a former train car factory that is being converted to produce tank parts. There has been significant backlash to the transformation. Sebastian Whipple, the AFD representative in the regional parliament, is reluctantly supportive of the factory conversion because of the jobs and revenue it will bring. But he insists it's only temporary, and as soon as Germany has enough tanks, the plant will revert to making non-military goods. Whipple, who wants a diplomatic resolution to the war in Ukraine, says that the Europeans have been sending the signal to Russia for a long time that we are not a reliable partner. Germany, Whipple went on, urged Russia to sign the Minsk agreements, the short-lived peace treaties signed after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, to give Ukraine time to rearm and take Crimea back. Europe and the whole of the West has to regain its trustworthiness in the eyes of Russia, Whipple told me. There are some AFD officials, however, who seem to relish the prospect of renewed great power politics. Maximilian Krah, a member of the German parliament, originally from a town not far from Görlitz, who is known for his insistence that not all members of the SS were criminals, is especially popular among young voters. He wrote a series of opinion columns for the Asia Times in which he argued that Trump's New World Order meant unprecedented opportunities for Germany that could usher in a golden age. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Krah wrote, the West invoked those old principles of international law as though some abstract legal order were at issue and not just power, plain and simple. Trump, he continued, is making politics honest again. Krah, a lawyer by training, cited a term coined by the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt, Grossraum, or Great Space, which encapsulated a spheres of power theory that took inspiration from the Monroe Doctrine and underwrote German expansionism. Krah argued that the United States and not Denmark was entitled to Greenland. He welcomed the decline of a phony, value-based justification of U.S. leadership and its replacement with a realist one, the deal. Renewed German military might in the hands of AFD members who have no problem speaking the language of power politics could prove disastrous for Europe. The post-war order was meant to do away with the question of dominance and the bloody competition for it by building multilateral structures. But as the Trump administration calls for cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory and announces plans to fund MAGA-aligned think tanks across the continent, those structures risk coming apart. This year in Munich, Rubio doubled down on this message, exalting the ties between Europeans and Americans as members of one civilization who are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share: Christian faith, heritage, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together in the name of this civilization, Rubio said. America would once again take on the task of renewal and restoration and was prepared, if necessary, to do this alone. Chancellor Merz, not a figure known for his humility, nonetheless offered a humble alternative vision. Big power politics in Europe is not an option for Germany, he said in Munich. Never again would Germans go it alone. Our country has gone down this path in the 20th century until the bitter and dreadful end. The West, he suggested, was not one civilization but a set of shared principles, partnerships, alliances, and organizations based on the law and on rules anchored in respect and trust. It was, after all, the Americans who had instilled such attachments in the Germans. We remain faithful to this idea, Merz insisted, with all our power and passion, with decency and solidarity, with creativity and courage. Germans and Europeans would carry this idea into this new age for the sake of future generations, he said, who rely on us in these weeks and months to do the right thing. Americans, America's go-it-alone campaign in Iran brought home precisely the kind of rashness and intransigence that continues to fuel European anxiety around Ukraine and Greenland. Yet Merz's response over the weekend made good on his vow to press Europe's geopolitical goals by speaking the language of power politics. He argued that this was not the moment to lecture our partners and allies, observing that European condemnations of Iranian violations of international law had achieved little over many years and decades, in part because Europe was not prepared to enforce fundamental interests, if necessary, with military force. In his meeting with Trump today, Merz represents a Europe that remains at odds with itself, even as its need to act in unison becomes more urgent by the hour. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the March 8th issue of the New York Times Magazine. Your reader has been Evelyn. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today. Following that, at 2 o'clock is episode number 5 of Buckeye by Patrick Ryan. Stay with us for these readings and more.
Hello,